When our guest from PepsiCo was on stage earlier on, he said a very interesting line. He said, "We will always have brands. For as long as consumers have emotions, we will always have brands." But which of us can actually deny that the relationship between brands and consumers has changed? And therefore also the relationship between brands and the intermediaries that help the brands reach those consumers. We all know how the business model has changed, and so we're now going to look at the role of brands in the 21st century. What is a brand really going forward? What sort of new ways of doing business do these brands need to adopt? And perhaps most critically, how do you then deliver against the increasing expectations for personalization? To that end, we have three guests here joining us in the panel discussion. Please hold your applause until I've introduced them all. We have with us Steve Blakeman, Chief Executive of OMD Asia Pacific. He's joined here by Billy Lagor, who's Senior Vice President and General Manager Asia Pac at Hasbro, and Stephen Haines, Global Agency Lead at Facebook. Please give them a round of applause as we bring on our moderator, Jeremy King, Content Director at C-Squared Networks. Jeremy. Jeremy, please go easy on Stephen, given his cricket predictions.
I'll try my best. Thank you very much, Mark. Much appreciated. As Mark rightly said, we had a great opening presentation this morning, all about brands and how they're operating. What we want to do is explore that a little bit further here. So we've put forward an expert panel to give us that flavour. As you may have noticed, we have an agency, a media owner, and a brand to give us as many different perspectives as possible and cover that whole media cycle. So without further ado, I think the first question we want to ask and make it make sense to the name of the session: what does a brand look like in the 21st century? Billy, we'll start with you first.
I think a brand in the 21st century has really become the cumulative sum of the experiences a consumer person has around that brand. And I think what's different from the past is it's really evolving. It's really changing over time. And if you think about it, the company may put out a starting point, whatever that may be, but as consumers interact with that, they end up taking as much ownership over the brand as either as the company that owns the brand or the media around it. So I think that's the key thing that we need to think about going forward, is that it's a story that evolves and changes, and over time, the fans of the brand, the consumer of a brand, have a greater input in telling that story. So it's really about each consumer's individual experience around the brand versus what a company may desire the brand to be.
And from an agency point of view, Steve, how does that differ in terms of what you see a brand being and how you see a brand operating and talking to its consumers from an agency perspective? What do you say to a brand?
I don't think my opinion differs at all. I'm kind of in violent agreement with Billy, to be honest. I think brands live in the minds of consumers, and actually, the point I guess that Shiv was making this morning, from PepsiCo about it's about trust in the brand. People have to believe in it, and they have to want to engage with it. And actually, that's really the strength and the power of any brand. It lives in the mind of the consumer.
And with platforms such as Facebook and other kind of media owners like that, you are doing obviously a lot of work for brands and amplifying their content in particular. Is there a view from a media owner that may differ slightly in terms of how a brand operates now?
No, I don't think so. I think both the guys have said, I think brands now, the word authentic, we speak a lot about. And if you think how consumers now, whether it be on Facebook or any platform, are sharing and creating content, those brands that are sort of, in a way, mirroring what consumers are doing on the chosen platform, we find are actually, getting the best results. It is all about the consumer and actually looking at their behavior and what they're doing on any given platform and looking at how they're actually using it.
And I suppose a big part of that is the content. We hear quite a lot now that content is king. I was at an event the other day, actually, and it was context is God if content is king, and an editor is Jesus these days. In terms of content, how do you go about developing content and making content that actually resonates with the audience of a brand? Steve, I know you're big on the content world over in agency, so give us an idea of how that works.
I always think about it in terms of ABC. And actually, Stephen's already mentioned one of them, which is authenticity. You have to really connect with your audience by being authentic to them. The audiences these days are incredibly savvy, and if they detect one essence of bullshit, then they will drop you like a stone. So authenticity is key. And another A, applicability. You need to ensure that you are connecting in an appropriate way. Another A. In terms of B, whatever you do really has to be breakthrough. You have to be offering something different to a consumer these days. The majority of what we see as content that's actually delivered to our audiences is frankly pretty poor. I would say 90% of it is rejected because most people aren't interested in it. And if you want them to share that content, which is absolutely critical, or else it's not going to live and breathe, then you have to make them care. And the C, I would say, is all about getting your channel selection appropriate. Market your marketing. It's not simply about putting a piece of content out there and hoping that it's going to survive. You have to ensure that it's actually going to be shared by the consumers.
And in terms of creating that content, where do you, as a brand, where do you go in terms of creating that content? Do you rely solely on the agency? Do you rely on the owner? Do you have an in-house content team?
I think we rely on a combination. So at Hasbro, we actually have Hasbro Studios that does all of our content development. But everything starts with the consumer and the insight around them. But also, as Steve said, what's relevant and what's meaningful. So you have a brand like My Little Pony, but what's the story about My Little Pony that a little girl's going to care about, right? And it's really about understanding that story. And then part of that story is, is what channel is it on? What is the length of the story, the type of the story? But it's really taking this story to, in this case, girls, that keep them interested in the brand. And so, we look at a lot of different ways and formats of doing that. And sometimes I'll call it basic digital content. It could be a movie, it could be television programming, but whatever that is, whatever that content format is, we have to make sure that we keep it fresh, keep it going, and keep it relevant to the audience.
And from your point of view, Stephen, how does it work with you in terms of the content you get? Because obviously you're producing your own content as well. Do you kind of come up with concepts and take them to the brand? How does that relationship work?
I think really it's a combination again. If you say look at what happened sort of 10 years ago, a piece of content that was successful in a given medium was then sort of moved to another one, and that was seen as the right way. I think now, with obviously technology growing and changing every single day, you've got to look at that individual platform to see what kind of content works, what the user wants. And the one word that we sort of bang on about all the time is relevancy. What is relevant for me? Facebook, you are an individual on Facebook with an identity. So what is relevant for me rather than 100 people that in a different platform? So I think relevancy is the big thing, and actually collaborating with the people that are producing that content, whether it's a client agency, creative agency, or us, because there's different expertise at everyone.
Yeah. And interestingly, all of you kind of mentioned the type of content you're producing, whether it's online, offline, the type of campaigns you're doing. We hear a lot about the 70-20-10 rule now. Obviously 70 being the majority of where the ad spend's going, 20 was kind of digital, and 10 were those risky kind of new breed of influencers, potentially, those new kind of guys that are out there and have got 23 million followers on YouTube. As a brand, I suppose, first, where are you kind of putting your money? We've heard a lot over the last 2 days all about, actually, it's not necessarily a mobile strategy, it's about having a digital strategy with mobile at the heart of it. Is that something that resonates with Hasbro?
It is. I think the key way we think about, though, innovation in terms of how we spend is, we know the tried and true, right? We know the impact of basic TV, basic digital. But I think the key thing is it really goes back to the heart of the brand, which is where is that consumer and how do we take risks and try things? So we don't necessarily do this, 70-20-10 bucket. I think it's more, are we challenging our brands to make sure that we're stepping into places that the consumer might be going? And that often means looking at types of new media. And it could be a new form of an existing media to a new platform to something no one's ever thought of before. But I don't think we just take a specific, apply 20% means digital, 10% means startup. It's really taking a look at the brand and saying, what are the most engaging ways we can try to introduce this content to the consumer?
And from an agency point of view, Steve, are you finding brands are more open to kind of the risk-taking now and the new kind of forms of media in terms of mobile, in terms of these new influencers?
Increasingly so. I think it could be much better, and I think agencies need to push the agenda. Clients need to be a bit braver too. Actually, I'm thinking about the presentation that Chu did yesterday, for example, and he was talking about success comes from innovation. So I think arguably we should be spending more of our time disproportionately on the 10% to think about what is true innovation, how to do things completely differently, because actually that's where you get tactical advantage.
And is Asia a good testing ground for risk taking? I'm just curious to know, in comparison to the rest of the world's markets, is it easier to test new ideas and take more risks here as a brand?
You want me to? Arguably, it should be. Given the nature, the dynamic nature of the markets that we have here in Asia. I think, though, people are a little reticent to really challenge themselves and try new things sometimes, which is a bit of a pity. I think we could all be a little bit braver here in Asia. And I think it's a challenge for all of us, agencies, clients, and vendors, to really try and innovate more than we actually do.
And from a media owner perspective, how do you ensure that the relationship works well with, we're seeing a lot of brands that are kind of trying to go around clients at different points and come straight to media owners. How do you guys deal with that? And is that happening a lot with Facebook?
I think it's changed, quite a bit. And I think especially in technology companies, and I will talk about sort of Facebook from, me working there. I think sort of 10 years ago, other non-technical companies, there was this very much a media owner agency client. The client briefs the agency briefs us, we then present back to the agency. I think it's changed a lot. The technology is changing every single day. So obviously consumer behavior is accelerating off behind a rate that we haven't seen for 60 years. So I think actually having everyone in the same room, I know that can't be possible all the time for time constraints and geographical mapping, but that is the best because, each of us has different strengths. And actually, if I look at our best results on Facebook, it's when those 3 or 4 parties have been in the same room collaborating on something and actually having that regular dialogue. Because like I said, what worked a year ago, that shouldn't be used again in the same template. It needs to be an ongoing relationship and partnership.
And I suppose one of the key things in terms of that ongoing relationship is kind of that collaboration. Are we getting closer now? We've seen a lot of convergence over the last few years. Would you say now that everyone is kind of at the top table? There's no one kind of taking the senior role amongst the brand, the client, and the agency and the media owner?
I'll answer that first. Then I think it's getting better. I still think. If I look at, like I said, the best results happen when all of us are together. But like I said, sometimes that just isn't possible. I think the other key thing is when that's not possible is actually, making sure that everyone in the room understands the consumer, whether it's making content that's relevant, us being transparent, what's happening on the platform. And actually, the word partnership, I think, gets overused, but we see that true partnership as literally evolving. It's never right. It just gets better and better. And if I use Steve as an example, we work very closely with Steve and his team for the last sort of 4 years in this region. And each week, we're finding out more information about clients, Facebook, because it's changing. And that's something that I think is happening in the speed.
And we saw earlier this morning, we talked about the kind of East learning from the West and the West learning from the East. In terms of the Asia Pacific, from a brand perspective, Billy, are brands kind of accelerating in terms of their marketing campaigns in comparison to those around the rest of the world?
No, I think, and back to Steve's earlier point, I think what's exciting about Asia Pacific, and more Asia probably than Pacific, is media platforms are evolving very differently. So in Asia, mobile in a lot of ways is leapfrogging the West. The role of digital is leapfrogging the West. A lot of the traditional things like TV are way too expensive to use. So there's a lot of natural things about Asia from a media perspective that almost force us to experiment and do things differently than the West. So I think that's part of the fun of being in this region is you're in a good way forced to experiment because simply the traditional stuff doesn't work here.
And when you're looking at countries such as Indonesia, where you've got such a large population, but the majority of it is kind of under 30, are they kind of giving you the opportunity to go into these new countries and really kind of try the risks in there?
Yeah, I think what's fun is, a lot of companies are just now, Indonesia seems to be one of the new frontiers, if you will. People are in China, they're now going to Indonesia, Thailand. And I think with a place like Indonesia, where you have such a significant overdevelopment of social versus other markets in Asia and certainly around the world. I don't think it's you have the opportunity. I think you have the responsibility to use these media because you have to understand how that market is evolving. And I think Indonesia is a good example of a market where things like media and things like social and mobile are primary platforms much more so than they are in other markets. So we need to focus on those more than what we consider traditional Western media outlets.
And how do you adapt to those nuances from all three of you, actually, from the nuances of the different countries? We know that as a region, Asia is actually quite diverse in terms of the different countries and how they operate. We were recently in China and speaking to quite a few brands and agencies and media owners down there, and they were kind of explaining how in Shanghai, for example, you have to have 7 different campaigns just for one part of Shanghai. You know. How do you adapt to all those nuances, and you know, how does a brand develop that key trust that we've talked about over the last few days in those different regions?
I think that's the strength of the region. It makes it such a dynamic region, by comparison to, say EMEA or North America or even Latin America. The diversity here is extraordinary. You think about China, you think about the differences between China and India. You move down to a very kind of Western type market like Australia. You have what I always think of almost like as a Latin American market with the Philippines. The diversity is extraordinary here, but that is a creative melting pot. That should really demonstrate the strength of the region. It doesn't always, unfortunately, but that's something that we're striving towards. And I was speaking with a client just last week about wanting groundbreaking ideas for their brands coming out of Asia that are going to be replicated across the rest of the globe. Far too often, it's an idea that's taken from, say, North America or Europe and then transposed upon this marketplace. We want to see the reverse happening in the future.
And with that comes an ever-evolving consumer, doesn't it? Who's constantly on the move, who's constantly staying ahead of you. How do you, from all three of your points of view, how do you make sure that brand, I suppose, can't stay ahead of a consumer, but actually almost keeps a pace? Because you're almost kind of fighting against a Usain Bolt, if you like, in a 100-meter sprint, trying to keep up with them. How do you stay relevant?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. I think, again, it comes back to the earlier conversation. It really starts with, what does the brand want to stand for? What's the insight and what's the consumer? And how do we deliver that? So I think you really have to start with what's the story that we're telling. And I think once you really think about that, then the platform's very per market, right? The first, from our perspective, for example, as a branded play company, we have to make sure the experience of the brand is great, right? So if our Transformers are a great experience, that's central. Without that, to Steve's point, authenticity, anything we say doesn't matter, right? So we have to start with that piece of it. But then we surround that with the story, right? The movies, the animation, in this case, and obviously there's other forms of content that different brands develop, but we also have to make sure that that's really moving the story forward from the mind of the consumer. And then once we have that basic piece of it, then we work with our, whether it be the platforms or our media partners, to really make sure that gets out there. And it is iterative. I mean, we're working, it's not like we develop one and pass it on. We start the process, we bring partners in early, and we create it from that perspective.
And how do you create those best stories? What's the kind of content that you need? Does it have a start, a middle, and an end? In certain regions, you can literally have a start, but there's no real end, and it's a continuous content. How do you keep that dialogue going and on a constant basis, I suppose?
For me, it's trying, it's back to that word authenticity again. It's trying to make something that actually just isn't a rehash of a 30-second TV commercial. I think about some of the best ones over the past couple of years. The PepsiCo NASCAR one from North America kind of sticks out in my mind. It was perfectly targeted to its audience of young men. I don't know whether you guys know the example I'm referring to, but basically it was a NASCAR driver took a test drive from a dealership in North America with an unsuspecting car salesman, and they ended up in a garage, spinning around in the vehicle. It was a 3-minute piece of content. They launched that on the YouTube vertical that they have, and it's currently up to about 50 million hits. It's been shared multi-million times. There's been spoofs made of that thing as well, and they marketed it too. They had a whole search and marketing campaign behind that as well. So, and I guess that's what I mean about creating content that's relevant for the audience. People, they cared about that content because actually they felt it was relevant to them. It was clearly authentic. It wasn't overtly branded. and they shared it with their friends because they thought it was funny.
I would say the other piece of that is there's no magic formula. A lot of it's as you develop, you then have to learn because there is that loop with consumers and how do they react and what's working and what's not. So you can rough out what you think a content plan might be for the next 3 years, but the reality is until you start understanding who's reacting to what.
Yeah.
In the example Steve gave, that had a great reaction. That's going to lead them down maybe a different direction than they thought versus if it didn't work. So I think that's the key part is you obviously plan based on what you think, but you really have to listen to the consumers around the world and adapt and be flexible, both in terms of format as well in terms of what the story or the message is.
Yeah. And I think that element of listening too is vital. That goes back into the thing that Shiv was saying this morning about trust. And there's an excellent example from McDonald's in Canada where they did just that. They listened to their consumers talking about their food. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was called Our Food, Your Questions. And what they did with that, they basically said, you can ask us any question you wish about our food and we will answer it. And that's exactly what they do. They're getting something like 400 or 500 questions per day. They've answered something like 10,000 questions, and they will literally answer any question. As tough as that question may be, they will answer the question, guaranteed. And I think that really demonstrates, beyond any shadow of a doubt, a brand listening to their consumers and reacting on the back of it. But I think very cleverly, they built that into a utility where actually it's now spread across every single form of communication. So it's become a TV campaign, a print campaign, a search campaign. So actually that is the campaign.
And that's quite interesting, kind of how you actually listen into the consumers. That's a question that I think the audience are quite interested in, how you do that. What are the key challenges trying to listen into those stories and those conversations?
So I will answer that, but I'm going to go back to a point that Billy made about format. I think I'm based in New York, and I've worked for Facebook in the UK and New York, and I actually love coming over to Asia Pac. So firstly, thank you for inviting me. I always get a sense of excitement when I come here, because if I look at Facebook, we started out as a desktop company, and about 2 years ago realised that what was happening, what our consumers were using Facebook, obviously on a mobile device, and then our engineers went through retraining, and now everything has to be mobile first. So any idea the product guys have, they have to go to the senior guys, and it has to be mobile first. And I think coming to Asia Pac, one of the staggering things that I'm always sort of amazed when I look at our figures is a lot of consumers here are actually engaging with Facebook for the first time on a mobile, not desktop. So I think any brand or any agency that doesn't have a mobile first strategy is massively behind the game. And we've talked about relevance, we've talked about authenticity, but the biggest thing that we're seeing the change is obviously the mobile device, and how people would rather lose their wallet now than their mobile phone, and what's actually happening and how you consume media. So the one thing I would say is one of the first things when we sit down with clients, with agencies, especially in this region, we actually feel that they're on the front foot here, because obviously a lot of the consumers are mobile first. And so brands in a way are naturally thinking about mobile first here. And I would say you can't think enough about that at the moment. This is absolutely crucial to anyone's strategy, anyone's storytelling, what's actually happening. And this region sort of amplifies that, which is incredible. We think it's fantastic.
And do we think that brands are actually taking advantage of that, though? I suppose that's the worry. You've got all the infrastructure set, the people are set. Are they taking advantage of mobile as much as they should be, perhaps?
You should ask Steve that.
Categorically not, no. The opportunity exists. I think we all know it and appreciate it. The consumers have latched onto it. I think we are laggards. I think as clients and agencies, we have not moved quickly to mobile, and I think that's to our detriment.
How do we change that? What's the policy we need to adapt? How do we do that as an industry?
Look, I think some of the formats on mobile as well have maybe not caught up yet. It's still a little bit clunky, but we're not even doing the basics particularly well. We're all going to have to start concentrating far more on actually how we connect with consumers utilising mobile, beyond simple kind of search and display.
Do you think that's an internal thing as well within brands, within everyone within the industry in terms of how their companies are set up? We had a conversation last night, and it's been kind of alluded to a few times in a few presentations, this whole role of a CMO, a CTO or a CDO in terms of actually where are they coming from? Are they engineers or technology scientists beforehand, or is it true marketeers? Are marketeers and technology not working close enough, do we think, in some of these brands or agencies or even media owners?
Okay. Well, I think the question is more which Steve hit with mobile. I think, certainly speaking, for my company, I know, a lot in our industry understand mobile, want to be in mobile. I think the difference with mobile is there's just not clarity on how to in mobile. So I don't think it's a lack of desire or willingness. And I know a lot of the conversations that we have with, Steve and the OMD team is, how do we win there? And you just right now don't have the clear technology platforms. Right, and particularly for us being in the kids market, which is different. But even with adult, as you said, Facebook is mobile first. Not everyone is as developed, not in terms of even just being on mobile, but how to market and how to get content out on mobile. So I think as the industry figures that out, there's a high willingness to experiment, but there's not a high understanding of how at this point.
Yeah. Even basic stuff. I mean, the majority of brand activity that's available in terms of video, for example, 90% plus of that is actually not owned by the brand. It's been shared by the individual. There's been clips. I was talking to one of the guys from Zephyr a couple of weeks ago, and he was basically saying, if you could just aggregate that power of the stuff that's out there. I mean, of course, there's going to be some negative stuff as well, and you have to filter that out. But the majority is positive. They're sharing it because they love the brand, and we're not harnessing the power of that. If we could just harness that power, it would accelerate things dramatically.
And what's the solution to that? Because we've heard about citizen journalism, we've heard about user-generated content, which that is, and you're right. The biggest challenge is the negativity that comes with it, doesn't it, as well as the positive stuff. But what are the kind of, if you had to give 2 or 3 key tips on enhancing that, what should brands, agencies, what should we be doing to utilise it?
Well, the first thing I would say is we do live in an imperfect world. I think we saw that from Dean from Malaysia Airlines yesterday, who I thought was fantastic. There are no simple solutions to this. There is always going to be negativity about brands. You have to filter it out as much as you can. But let's focus on the positive stuff. You can aggregate all of that content and actually do campaigns behind it. Why can't you be running pre-roll against that material that actually exists out there that's actually been positive towards your brand, for instance?
And you're right, again, it's that, talk about pre-roll, it's that authenticity, we come back to it, don't we, as well, making sure that it's content that doesn't seem, it's being forced onto you, it's actually part of that story, part of the editorial, the piece.
Actually, you find some of the movie studios, for example, and the TV vendors have actually latched onto that much quicker than the advertising fraternity. They've realized that people uploading their favorite clip from their favorite movie is an advert for their movie. And actually, if you aggregate again, that love that's out there for their movies, actually you can harness the power of it.
Okay, thank you guys. I notice on the clock we have a few minutes left, so I wouldn't want to go without giving you guys the opportunity to ask some questions. Does the floor have any questions? Oh, yes.
I'm Vasu from AXA. Marketing is beginning to understand that the world is more like South Korea, democracy, and not like North Korea. And in a democracy where politics are important, what are lessons from politicians where we know politicians with high integrity often don't win, and where smear campaigns seem to be more effective? What are the lessons for brands?
It's a toughie, guys. Who would like to go for that first?
Not me. Come on, Hainesy.
You're a brand.
Come on.
I think it comes back. I can't answer that and give any sort of case studies off the bat. But I think if I look at some of the things that we're running on the platform at the moment, it comes down to sort of authenticity and being a true voice. We've seen lots of people, individuals, have sort of huge success on the platform by speaking in a language that the users, their followers, actually understand them to, it's them, it's their real person. And I think where brands, humans, individuals, companies are trying to do something else that's not them, like I said, the user will immediately turn off. So I think it probably doesn't answer your question in terms of the specifics, but again, it comes back to being true to yourself and having that voice that's authentic and actually you.
Yeah, I would agree. The one thing from politics, I think we've, in general that translates is authenticity matters. So I think, Malaysia example yesterday was a good one, which is consumers know and they're going to find out. So I think being honest and authentic up front with consumers, I think is a key thing. So I don't think it's necessarily what do we learn from politicians that translate into brands. I think it's more what do we learn about how consumers respond to different behaviors, and I think it's really becoming very singular that having that authentic, open, honest relationship with the consumer is is the only way to win. And so I think that would be the one thing I would extrapolate from that.
Yeah, me too. I think it's the honesty angle again. The McDonald's example that I mentioned earlier, I think is a prime example of that. Embrace something that's negative and turn it into a positive.
Okay, any more questions out there, guys? Yes, just in the middle there.
Who do you think is more effective in boosting engagement and promotion, traditional media brands or these individual content creators?
Sounds like a Stephen question to me.
I think we're reaching a tipping point. I think actually it's the smaller content creators that are actually beginning to excel. Actually, we're learning from them, and actually the more we can learn from them, the better.
Okay, and we're going to finish 10 seconds early, which is a first for me. So let's give a big round of applause to Steve, Billy, and Stephen. Thank you.